Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this Honda EU 2000i. This one comes to us from a local subscriber who actually got this for free. His neighbor offered it to him. He accepted, no questions asked. So, he actually didn't try to start it. He just dropped it to us, kind of assuming the worst. So for all we know, there is nothing wrong with this machine. That said, though, likely we do have issues because there are signs that someone was trying to start this. The choke is on, the ignition's on, eco throttle's off. So likely someone unsuccessfully tried starting this and just gave up on it. So, if we're lucky, it needs nothing at all, or maybe just the fuel system gone through. So let's start with the basics. Let's check the oil. We'll add some fuel if needed, and then pull it over a few times as is and see if this shows any signs of life. And I see we're missing the little plastic cover here, and we have a little cocoon of sorts right there. So that plastic piece we can order up and replace. This bolt actually is loose, so someone definitely has been in here at some point. Pretty dusty, and we've got some spider webs. So let's just blow out some of these cobwebs. And let's see what we have for oil. It should be filled up right to the last thread. And it's not, but we do have a fair amount of oil. I wouldn't say we're in the danger zone, but it is a little lower than I'd like to see. So, we will change the oil, once we know we have a good machine, but as it is right now, it should be fine to test with. And it looks like the tank vent was left in the open position, so that's going to let air into the tank. So if there is any fuel in there, it's going to go bad faster. And yeah, there is a fair amount of corrosion on the bottom of that cap. So I would say there is or was bad fuel in there. So let's get the filter out and have a look inside. Yeah, it's kind of hard to get a good look in there, but from what I can see, it doesn't look good. The fuel, it is pretty dark. I'm not even sure I would call that fuel anymore because it doesn't smell like fuel. I'm not sure what it smells like, but fuel, not so much. So I'd say between what we see and smell there and what we see on the cap, that fuel has gone bad. And it's been in there for quite a while. So luckily, it is a plastic tank, so we don't have to worry about that. But I do worry about the carbs. So, let's actually take a sample from the tank so we can get a better look at what we're dealing with. And I'm thinking we should probably drain the bowl and see if that, by chance, was stored dry. There's not a lot in there, so I'm not sure if this is going to get much, if any, out. Oh yeah, look at that. Just coming up the tube, it is super dark. Yeah, that is like pure varnish. And we got a few drops coming out. Actually looks like there's water in there as well. Yeah, and the smell is terrible. So yeah, the fuel system, not good. The tank definitely has to be cleaned out. Yeah, I think we're actually going to have to take the tank out of the machine to clean it properly. So yeah, I would say this machine's not going to run on what's in that tank. So let's not even try to start it. I think we need to take the whole fuel system apart. Yeah, before we take this apart, let's just drain the bowl. I'm kind of curious to see if the problems extend there as well. And no, nothing's coming out of the bowl. So Either it's so clogged up that it can't come out, or maybe the carb is clean. That would be nice. So to gain access to the tank, we do need to kind of get all the plastics off, starting with the ends. We need to remove all the screws. This panel comes out of place. We can remove the 4 bolts here and just kind of slide this a little bit out of the way. And then we have some fasteners on the top and the bottom, and each side should come away from the machine. And at that point, we'll have good access to the fuel tank, the fuel lines, and really the entire fuel system. And unlike the last one I took apart, these fasteners look pretty clean. Virtually no corrosion. So this should come apart pretty easily. And I had to pull this top piece off because there are 2 bolts there we need to remove. And we've got 2 more down below. And the last 2 bolts that hold this on, they're behind this trim piece, which technically you could potentially get to that one without pulling the trim. But the other bolt, not so much. It's right there. So just a 10mm socket to get those out. And now this side should be free to come off. And on this side, we do need to remove this trim piece before pulling this plastic off. And we also have to detach the starter recoil. There is a screw right there that holds this outer skin to this black piece. So once that's released, we can get the plastic off and leave that starter rope behind. All right, so we're in, we have access, we have good sight of kind of everything in here. And the problem that we need to deal with right now is the tank. As far as the rest of the system, I'm not quite sure, how far the issue extends. We have a fuel pump, all the lines in between, and of course the carburetor. So we're going to start at the beginning. We'll get that cleaned up, and then we'll go from there. The tank is held in place by this plastic piece right here, and it's actually split in half. So there's one piece on each side of the machine. Technically we could just remove the back piece, which would be simpler because there's only one screw holding that in place. And then that plastic would move out of the way and we could slide the tank out. The issue is the tank fuel line is connected to the front here where this valve is, so you can't actually get it out the backside without first disconnecting the line. And to do that, you actually need to get this piece off. So yeah, this one's a little more complicated because we have the fuel valve, the fuel pump, and the recoil. But it's not overly difficult to do. Really, we just need to disconnect these lines. There's another screw right there that lets this piece pull all the way through. And the fuel valve, yeah, that is part of this. But I think once we get these other two things disconnected and the screws removed, we can kind of pivot this to the side and actually remove the tank with the fuel valve. So let's see if we can get these lines to kind of twist a little and break free. And no, I'm going to damage the line if I do that. So let's try sliding it off. All right, so that is the impulse line. That's what drives the pump. You know, every time the piston goes up and down, it creates a pulse of pressure, and that moves the diaphragm and moves the fuel using check valves to kind of set the direction of flow. The top one here, this is the fuel line. And most likely there is fuel in here. I don't know. Actually, it looks pretty dry. So that is a good sign. And let's see if these bottom two crack free. The last machine I worked on actually damaged the case a little bit, because this screw actually goes into a captured nut, which is held in place by this base plate, and that is made out of plastic. So if you apply too much force, that plastic's going to break. And oddly enough, that's the one that broke on the other machine, so that was pretty stuck on this one as well. But it did break free. All right, and we're almost free. We're going to disconnect the ignition switch. Since this also shuts spark off, we have some wires going to that fuel valve. And the only thing connected now should be the tank. So the bottom line, that's the one we're after. That's the one that connects to the tank. So you could disconnect it right here, but there's actually a fuel filter in the tank. And given all the junk in the tank, I think we should actually just disconnect it here. You know, that way we can get that filter cleaned up as well. All right, so that is the filter. It actually looks halfway decent. Although it is stuck in that line pretty well. So we might have to order a new one, because if I pull on this too hard, might break it, although it is coming. All right, so we got the filter. We'll set that aside. Let's drain out what's left in this tank, and then I'm thinking we can rinse it maybe with some fresh gasoline. So there's not a whole lot left in here, but you know, we got to get this all out. If there's a little left, you know, that could go right into the carburetor. And just that much bad fuel in the carb could definitely cause a run issue. So yeah, at this point, we're mostly empty. So let's give this a rinse and take a look in there and make sure we got it all out. So we don't need much, just a little to kind of swish around, shake around. And I did also cap off the fuel tank just with a vacuum cap, so we're not going to leak any fuel. I'm going to put this on, and the vent ideally should be closed, which looks like it is in that position. And just drain it out. And we'll just do that a few times until the fuel comes out looking like it did when I put it in. And that actually looks pretty good. So yeah, plastic tanks, definitely the way to go. So nice, easy cleanup. Let's just take a look in there, make sure we got it all. Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell. You know, the tank is dark in color, but as far as I can see, you know, I think we did get the majority of it out. So as far as the tank goes, I think we're looking pretty good. And you can kind of see what we were dealing with here. So the good looking clean fuel on the top, that's what we added to the tank. And the stuff on the bottom, that's what we flushed out. That's actually water, and not even clean water. It looks like it's contaminated with a bunch of debris. So yeah, for sure, you know, that tank had to be cleaned, because if any of that gets into the carb, the engine's not going to run. And while we have easy access to this, let's just tip it upside down, see if any fuel comes out of the lines. And yeah, wouldn't call it fuel, but there is something in the lines for sure. But not much. So I'm going to flush that with some fresh fuel, see if we can push it through the pump. Yeah, I want to make sure all that water is purged out of the system. All right, the fuel coming out now looks nice and clean. So let's take a look at the carb next. I'm going to feed it a little bit of fuel. We'll see if the carb accepts it or not. So I'm going to open up the drain again. You know, we didn't get anything out of it the first time. And we're not getting anything out the second time, which we shouldn't, assuming it's empty. So let's feed the carb a little bit of fuel. And if things are flowing, we should see this dropping, which it is. And we should see fuel coming out, which it is. So the carb may have avoided the worst of it. So I'm going to close this and we're just going to fill the bowl, see if the needle shuts off. And if it does, let's try to start it like this. See if the carb is capable of running, and not only running, but running well. And that flow should be slowing down, so the needle might actually be stuck. Although it is slowing a little. Yeah, it might be working. The fuel, it is advancing very slowly now, which is kind of normal. The bowl is still filling up just a bit, and the more it fills up, the harder it pushes that needle closed. So it's either going to seal or it's going to float over in a minute. Either way, needle and seat, they're either working or mostly working, and the carb should be full of fuel. So let me secure this line a little bit better. We'll pull the engine over, see if it comes to life. Well, it's been a few minutes and the fuel level is holding perfectly. So needle and seat, they seem to be working. So based on that and the fact that nothing came out of the bowl, I'd say this carb, it has a chance. So choke is on, eco throttle is off, and the ignition switch, it is bypassed. So we're going to have spark, and if we need to shut it down quickly, we're going to have to either choke the engine out or pull the wire off the spark plug. So let's see if it starts. And yeah, we're not getting any signs of life. Let's try choke off. And choke back on. And no. We get nothing. So yeah, I was hoping the carb was okay based on what we're seeing with the needle and seat. But given the fact that it's not starting, either we don't have spark or more likely the main jet is plugged up. So let's actually throw the spark checker on there real quick and make sure spark isn't the issue. All right, so we're gonna use the spark checker. Right now it's indicating low, obviously because we're not pulling the engine over. What we wanna see is that the green light lights up, which indicates we have spark, at least on the coil. And yeah, good spark, so no surprise, fuel, that's the problem. All right, so let's get the carb off. It'd be interesting to see the condition of this air filter. This machine, it's actually one of their, I think, first models. Honda came out with this in 2001, and according to the sticker here, it meets the 2003 emissions standard. So, puts this machine at about 23 years old, and the filter, surprisingly, still in good condition. So next we got to get the airbox off. There is a bolt right there and two nuts there. So once those are removed and the breather detached, that airbox should come right out. And someone was in here at some point. This fuel line should have been like that, held in place by that clip. So, potentially, maybe we pulled that out when we disassembled things over there, but I don't think so. So I would say someone was in here at some point. So I'm going to get that fuel line back out of the clip. And we'll separate it fully from the carburetor. All right, so the carb, it is just about ready to come off. The only thing really holding us on is this wire harness. This is a stepper motor and is controlled by the inverter module. So there is no mechanical governor on this. And the wire harness can be unplugged from the stepper motor. But we have to get the cap off to get that harness unplugged. All right, so we got the cover off, and this wire harness right here is what controls the position of the throttle. So that just unplugs. We can set the wire aside, and theoretically the carb should come out. But we do need to kind of fish these lines out at the same time. And there we go. All right, so let's get the lines off and just set them aside. And the big question is, how bad is it? I don't think it's going to be that bad. The fact that the needle and the seat are working, as well as the drain, is a good sign. So we'll just get what fuel is in the bowl out, and then just an 8mm bolt holding that bowl on. Yeah, a little bit of corrosion on that bowl, but not too bad. And yeah, bit of corrosion, maybe varnish, but that should clean up. Needle's not stuck, which we knew, although looking down the center, that main jet looks to be plugged solid. So yeah, that is the issue. That's why this thing showed absolutely no signs of life. So let's see if that will come out. And it's actually not getting a good bite on there. So I think there is just a bunch of corrosion and junk in that jet. So I'm not going to force it. I think we do need to soak it first, and we could come back and try to get that out. So before we put this in the ultrasonic, we do need to get the stepper motor off. So there are 2 JIS screws here on the top, which don't like to come out. So usually you have to use the impact. So we'll do that in a second. The other thing to keep in mind is that there is a spring right there that likes to launch and get lost. Also a plastic piece there, which is a separate piece just held in place by the sandwich. So you got to hold that in place, when you lift the servo off. That way you don't lose the plastic piece or the spring. So these do not like to come out, especially if they've never come out. So I am using a JIS. And no, that one's not budging. Let's try the other. All right, that one broke free. So we just have this one right here, which I'm kind of worried about stripping out. These do strip out pretty easily. And this screwdriver doesn't have a good bite, even though it's a JIS. So let me see if I can find one that fits a little better. Yeah, we'll try this one. This is also a JIS, slightly different tip. Yeah, seems like a much better fit. Nope. No, that is not turning at all. So we'll hit it a little bit with the impact. Hope for the best, but I think we might need to use a manual impact on this one. Yeah, let's get the manual impact before there's nothing left of that screw there. So we'll give this a go. We are risking causing damage to the carburetor by doing this and the gaskets. But we're going to clamp this in place pretty tight. And let's try to get this out. That did it. So now we need to hold that piece in place. And I almost lost the spring, but you can see it right there. Okay. So now it's just like any other carb. So we'll get this idle set out. Now technically this machine does idle, but the throttle position and the idle, it's controlled by the stepper motor. So I don't think the position of this screw is super critical, although I think the Honda manual does say, or does have a procedure on how to set the idle with this screw. So we might circle back on that, but I think when I put this back together, we're just going to poke it through a little bit like it was. And lastly, we have the pilot. So let's see if we can pop that out. Yep. That's more or less it, except for the main jet. So I'm going to go through that maybe with some carb spray, see if we can get some of the junk out of there. And we'll give this another quick try. No, that really didn't do anything. So I'm kind of wondering now if the main jet is stripped out. You know, the screwdriver does kind of drop down in the slots, but as soon as you apply any twisting movement, you know, it just pops right out. And it feels pretty sloppy in there. So yeah, this carb, you know, someone may have previously caused some damage here. And here's a real close-up of what I'm talking about. So yeah, someone, I think, broke the main jet. You know, there are still slots there for the screwdriver, but you can see it's kind of chewed up. And I think that's why we can't get a bite on it. So, you know, potentially we need to drill that out if we're going to try to save this. Yeah, I guess the question is, do I have another main jet for an EU 2000? That I am doubtful of, but let me take a quick look and see what I have. And no, I just double checked. I don't have another jet for this carburetor. So that is something that has to be ordered up. Likely we could use like a screw extractor to pull that out, but there is some junk in there. And I'm thinking, someone tried this in the past and failed. So even if this was in good condition, likely it's not going to come out until we clean it. So I'm going to let this soak in the ultrasonic, and maybe after 10 minutes I'll take it out. We'll try to get the jet out again, and either it's going to come out or we're going to strip it the rest of the way, in which case I'll probably leave good enough alone for now. Likely it'll run, but if the emulsion tube has issues, then we can't gain access to that with the jet in the condition that it's in right now. So let's just clear that jet, and surprisingly not plugged up. So I don't know if the carb spray cleared it, or maybe it was never clogged. But I'm hoping it was, because otherwise, that doesn't really explain why we didn't get any signs of life, unless maybe the pilot's clogged. And no, pilot's not clogged either. So very interesting. All right, so let's try getting this main jet out again. We're either going to finish the job of stripping it out or get the jet out. And no, it's not budging, but it's not stripping out either. So might try the impact on low. Ideally I'd apply some heat, to this aluminum right here. The issue is we have a plastic seat, so can't really do that. No, I don't think that jet moved. I think we're just stripping it out. Yeah, there's just no way to get a bite on that jet. So, yeah, I think it's too stripped out. So, yeah, hopefully the emulsion tube's not clogged. All right, things cleaned up pretty well. Not that it was that bad to begin with. I think the worst of it was the bowl, and that is now clean. We are left with some corrosion, but that should not impact the way it runs. I think the big issue here was the main jet. It was plugged up, and it is clear now. So this should run. Now, ideally, I would remove the main jet, but that is all chewed up as far as where the slots go for the screwdriver. So, I did try removing it again and pretty much finished the job. So if this carburetor doesn't run well, I guess, we have two options: either replace it or, try a screw extractor to remove that jet. But doing that would require you to drill out the center, and then this carb, as it is right now, has no chance of running. But, I believe that center hole is clear now, and as long as no one drilled that out, this should run pretty well and likely not need replacement yet. So let's get this back together. I guess we'll start with the pilot jet and the screw for the idle set. So we're just going to turn that in until about 2 threads poke through on the other side. Like that. Main jet, obviously we don't have to worry about. It's already installed. So that just leaves us with the needle and the float. All right, so that is good. We'll get the bowl back on, being sure to face the drain toward the front. And we can close the drain. Okay, and the only thing left is to get that stepper motor back on. So we need to get this plastic piece reinstalled. The spring sits in here, so we need to carefully get that in place. Like that. And now we just install the stepper. All right, that's pretty much it. So let's get it reinstalled and try it out. All right, so we'll get this back in place. The overflow, those lines go behind the breather and the impulse line, and the drain in front. And we'll get the servo plugged back in. And the cap on, which was also run through the ultrasonic. Like that. And then we can get the airbox back in. So this, I also ran through the ultrasonic. It wasn't super dirty, but there was some oil and a bit of dirt on it. So now it is spotless. And the breather plugged back in. Then we just have the nuts and the bolt to hold it all in place. Yeah, we're going to get this filter oiled up before getting it back on. There should be oil on this filter. You know, foam filters don't really do a good job without the oil. So just put on a generous amount, you know, work it in, then get the excess out. And I just use a towel to kind of get the excess removed. And we'll put that back in place, as well as the pre-filter. So we'll get some fuel back in the carb and we'll try to start it again. You know, based on what we found in there, it should, at a minimum, show signs of life, if not run well. All right, we're topped off with fuel. Let's try starting it again. All right, let's try it out. Eco throttle is off. Choke is on. That was a pretty good test. You know, for a machine that hasn't run, I would say, in a long time, you know, it started right up. The engine sounded good and we're making power. So for the most part, we're good to go. That said, though, we're not perfect. You know, the carb, it is running lean without a load on the machine. So that tells me that the pilot circuit, it is still clogged up a bit. So we might need to pull the carb off and go through it again. But I'm thinking for now, let's try to do the easy thing and just get the stepper motor removed. That'll give us access to the pilot jet. And we can go through that one more time, restart it, and see if anything improves. All right, so we'll get that cover removed. Wire harness unplugged. We'll set that aside. And we got to pull the screws again and carefully lift this off without losing that spring. And now we can just remove the idle set and lift that jet out of there. Yeah, jet feels pretty good. So we could try drilling this out. The problem is, even just going up one size might make it too rich. So yeah, we'll try this first. You know, it does feel like there's a little bit of plaque potentially on the side. So we'll just use this to clean it out. There's kind of a file edge on it. And there's also an O-ring right there too. It's hard to see. It's black, same color as the plastic, but if that O-ring isn't making a good seal, then it's not going to pull the fuel properly through the jet. So I might have a replacement for that. So let me see if I have one for this. And we'll swap that out. And hopefully that fixes the surging issue. So we'll give these a try. They do fit kind of the larger Honda machines like the GX 390. I'm not sure if it's going to fit on something as small as this, but just eyeballing it, looks to be the same size. So we'll set that O-ring aside. Okay, good. Seems to be the right size. So let's get this reinstalled and we'll try it again. All right, let's try this again. The carb is back together. Pilot jet reinstalled with a new O-ring and ran through it excessively to make sure it was clear. So we'll turn the choke on. Eco switch is off. Hopefully it runs better without choke. And no change really. So yeah, the changes we made on that pilot jet with the new O-ring and just making sure it was spotless didn't really change the run condition on this. So kind of on the fence as far as how I want to proceed with this. You know, we have a bowl that has corrosion, we have a main jet that is stripped out, and we have a pilot system that's not working right. So, you know, we could try cleaning this again, maybe start drilling some jets. But in my experience, that usually doesn't end well on these. So I might get a new carburetor, OEM of course, you know, given the numerous issues we have here. So yeah, let me see if there's one available, kind of what price it's at, and make a decision as far as where to go. So I think we're going to have one last go at this carburetor. You know, I took a look online. You know, of course, this part, it is available. But I think the prices have gone up quite a bit because a new OEM carburetor from a parts site, not cheap. You know, they start at about $200, and depending on where you buy it from, you could spend up to $300. And I spoke to the owner. He, you know, if it comes down to buying a new part, you know, he's fine with that, but he wants OEM. He doesn't want to put a clone part on here, which I totally get and would recommend the same. But usually if these don't run right after the initial cleaning, you know, the odds that it's going to run right on a second cleaning drop dramatically. But yeah, given the price, I think it's worth another go. All right, so we're back here again. I've got most of the things off, including the stepper motor and the bowl, as well as the float in the needle. Now, this carb, although not perfect, it does have issues. The corrosion in the bowl, that isn't causing any of the problems we're having now. And the fact that the main jet is stripped out also, I think, is unrelated. The emulsion tube could be clogged up, but that would only cause issues when running under load. So this is untested, but the issue we're having now, that is limited to the pilot circuit. So the pilot circuit actually picks up its fuel through this little passage right here. You can see the tube has this little section here. So that's where it draws fuel into the pilot circuit. And it's actually on the other side of the main jet. So that could be a problem, if there's a blockage there. Once the fuel comes up, it goes through the bottom of the pilot jet, and then it's mixed with air, which comes from this side, and it goes over into the throat of the carburetor. So the pilot circuit, the fuel doesn't come through the emulsion tube. It comes through this little hole right here, which is hard to see. It's actually in front of the throttle plate, and you can adjust it right there. And there's actually a few other tiny little holes just past the throttle plate. And as that plate opens up, it exposes more of those holes. So if I had to guess, I would say one or several of those holes are blocked and or the actual passages. So what I'm going to do is, I guess, first off, get that pilot jet back out. That I think we've kind of ruled out. It seems to be pretty clear. We have a new O-ring on it. But what I want to do is probably spray through here with some carb spray and just see if I can see that spray coming out those little passages right there. So before I do that, I do need to remove this bowl gasket because the carb spray, it damages the neoprene. So let's see if we can pick that out without causing any damage to it. There we go. So what I'm going to do is block up down here, as well as where the pilot jet used to be. And we're going to go through the air pickup for the pilot system. And if we put carb cleaner in there, we should see it spraying out the throat of the carb. And we do. Yeah, so no smoking gun on this. This carb seems to be fine. But what I'm going to try to do next is actually remove the limiter cap so that we can get that needle out. That way we can clean the passage a little better. And I'm going to soak this for half an hour. And while it's doing that, I'm also going to check the engine side. I want to make sure that there's no air leak between the carburetor and the engine, which would also cause surging like we're seeing. So this is the cap here we're going to try to remove. It limits how far you can turn this needle. Right now we are turned all the way counterclockwise, so it's as rich as it can be made. And if we turn it counterclockwise, that's as lean as you can make it. So we're going to put it in the richmost position because if you do it wrong, you're just going to break the needle off and then you can't adjust it anymore. So we want to leave it at least where it's doing the most good. Now, on larger machines like the GX390, you can apply heat to this and it releases the glue and you can pull it off. On something like this, I'm not sure if it's going to work, but it is worth a try. So I've blown this dry, so all the carb spray and gasoline should be evaporated at this point. And we're going to apply some heat, but not too much. We don't want to melt the plastic seat. And that's not enough heat apparently. Either that or this is not going to work. So we'll give it some more. Yeah, I think it's loosening up. Yeah, this may not work on this carb. But my understanding is that there's some glue or potentially some other adhesive holding this cap onto the brass down below. And there we go. So we now have access to the needle. We can take that out and actually clean that passage properly. So now that we have that limiter off, we can remove the jet. But before I do that, I'm going to turn it in and just see where it's at currently. So there's half, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, just over 2.5 turns. And there we go. So fine little tip on that needle. And now we have full access to clean through that way, so the ultrasonic would do a better job. I'm also going to spray a little bit of carb spray through there, just make sure everything is clear in that passage. And now, we can essentially spray backwards through that entire passage. So if there's some junk in there, doing what we did before, we're just pushing it further down. And these tiny little holes, likely are blocking it or preventing any debris that may or may not be in there from coming out. So yeah, let's clean through there. And at this point, I think we've done all we can. We're just going to give it an extra long soak and hope for the best. And I'm pretty sure this area is the issue here, because when I block the jet that's directly across and I spray in here, I would expect to see a fair amount coming back to where the pilot jet was. And I see some, but there's a lot of pressure building up, so it's not flowing freely. Yeah, a lot of pressure. So I think the blockage is somewhere kind of in this area. And, I'll spray through it a little more with the carb cleaner, but I think we're going to have to maybe up the game in the ultrasonic and use a cleaner that's a little bit more aggressive. And actually, now that we have that needle out too, there's something else we can do, which is run a torch tip cleaner through the air pickup, and you should see it come out where the pilot jet is. And then we can keep going pretty much all the way to the end and just make sure it can reach, which, yeah, it is going all the way in. So, that passage seems to be clear. So yeah, I wouldn't say there's a smoking gun on this, but hopefully getting that needle out gives us kind of the edge we need to get this running right. And the other thing to consider here is the condition of the gasket and the insulator. It's a piece of plastic. Sometimes these can crack, but visually, the gasket looks fine, and so does the insulator. So, I can't rule this out, but I don't want to change too many things either at the same time. But I'm fairly confident that this is not the problem here. And for this cleaning, we're going to use the regular Simple Green. It is a much better cleaner, but not safe for metal, so it could definitely discolor the carburetor. But we tried the nice stuff to begin with, which is the Pro version that is safe for metal. And, well, that didn't do it, so let's give this a go. And for the record here, I am putting this cap back. We set the needle back to the factory position of just over 2.5 turns out, and the cap is also going to go in the same position. Why, you might ask? Well, at least where I am, it's against the law to tamper with this system and can carry fines of up to $45,000. So you want to make sure you set it exactly back to how it was. And even this, I think, is a gray area. But the confusing thing is you do have the right to repair. And that is the only reason this came off in the first place. Like it never happened. All right, carbs back on the machine. Soaked it for 30 minutes. I'm not too optimistic about this, but let's try it. You never know. It had me worried there for a minute. Although it started first pull and I could turn the choke off right away, the engine still wasn't running very steady, at least initially when the engine was cold. But it was definitely better. And as the engine warmed up, things seemed to smooth out. So just to make sure, I put on a 750 watt load. Things ran perfect, doubled it to 1500 watts, and things continued to run fine. I then took the load off, the engine speed came down, and it settled in a nice idle. So I dare say this carburetor, although it has issues, I think it's good to go. So we're going to get this back together, meaning the fuel line attached, before getting it installed on the machine. It's going to be a lot easier that way. So the fuel filter, I did clean it with some carb spray. It wasn't that bad, but since we had it out, might as well make sure. Okay. Now we can get this back on the machine. And we'll get the ignition switch reconnected. And get the recoil in place. And then the fuel pump. Make sure the impulse line goes on the bottom. That one does not have a clamp. And then the top is the fuel line. And now we'll get these long bolts in through the bottom. And they're not just for holding the case together. They actually go through a mount down here, which holds the engine to the base plate. So if it's not going in right, sometimes you got to wiggle things around. But that one went right in. And before we get the end panels on, we have to install the trim pieces. It's actually the end panels that help key it in and prevent it from falling off. So they overlap just a little bit. So we get the one on the other side in, and then we can get the ends secured. And the control panel, kind of fighting me a little bit. The left side went right in. The right side seems to be hung up on something. So, I don't want to force it. We could break something. So I'm just going to work at this a bit until things go in place. Then we can add the final fasteners. Yeah, I see the issue now. The little tab that holds the tank in place on this side, it's not holding the tank. So the tank's actually too far this way on the right side. So like that, we can't actually get this together. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I need to get at least this side back off to fix the tank issue, and then we can finally get this together. And that's the problem right there. So when I put the tank in, I wasn't paying attention on the far side, but that little mistake cost a few minutes of time. So now that the tank is in the right spot, this should go right together. And that's kind of a good thing about Hondas. They built them to such high tolerance that things just don't go right together like that. Then chances are something's wrong. And you don't want to tighten it down because you could make things worse. So we'll get the final bolts in. You know, we still have the side cover off and that metal handle protector to add. And of course, we'll shine this up a bit. And I think we'll be ready to do a little bit of testing outside with this machine. All right, so let's give this thing a try. This machine, it is rated at 1600 continuous watts. So I've got a 1500 watt space heater and a 100 watt light. So together we will be right up against the max. So let's get the engine started. While it's warming up, we'll double check the output using the kilowatt to measure the voltage and the frequency. We'll use the amp probe to measure the total harmonic distortion and the oscilloscope to see what the waveform looks like. Now, anything below 5% THD is considered safe. These machines usually come in well below that. But being that this is more or less the first version of the EU2000, I'm kind of curious to see if there is any noticeable difference in the output on this machine versus some of the others we've tested. So let's get the engine started. And no issues at all. Started right up, first pull, and the engine is idling perfectly. Without a load, we're at 0.8% THD, which is very good. And the sine wave looks perfect. So let's put on approximately a half load at 750 watts. No issues at all. THD unchanged. We're at 0.8% and the sine wave is unchanged. So we'll give that a few minutes and then we'll go for the max of 1600 watts. All right, it's been a few minutes. Everything's running absolutely perfect at 850 watts. So let's bring it up to the max of 1600 and no issues at all. So that's kind of a hard ask with the eco switch on, but it had no issues with it. THD went up a tiny bit. We're now at 0.9%. So that is extremely good. And the sine wave continues to look perfect. So yeah, not too bad. Yeah, no issues. The overload light is off, so it's handling the 1600 watts without issue. So I'm going to take the load off and we'll let the engine cool down before shutting it down. Alright guys, and that is pretty much it. This machine, thankfully, wasn't a total disaster. Really, the big story here was the fuel system. The entire thing had to be gone through, the tank to the carburetor and all the parts in between. And clearly, someone else tried to get this running. That carburetor had been cleaned recently, and likely they gave up on it. And although we got it to run, it wasn't running right. That pilot circuit was to blame, and the only way to clean it properly was to remove the needle, and to do that, we had to remove the limiter cap. So yeah, I kind of regret showing that on video. I really didn't look up the details of that law until after the fact. But the confusing thing is, we do have the right to repair, and that carburetor needed repair. So after we did that, the carb is now fixed, and we're set back to the factory settings with the limiter reinstalled. So yeah, I guess the question to you is, was that right? And is that allowed? Let me know in the comments. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.